Morning all. I find myself studying in detail another Adams game from the British Chess Championship. I thought I'd got my analysis notes prepared, but actually I added a few variations this morning. It's some incredible complexity on these games. Let's have a look. So Eggleston was like the hero of the championship on the live stream. He was beating and playing very, very strong, grandmasters. I believe he might have got another GM norm actually. So congratulations to him, David Eggleston. Here he was black. He was really up against it, against the top seed Michael Adams. So E4 for Michael Adams is in round 8. We have a Sicilian defense, an open Sicilian. Knight F6 first. You might think that's quite curious. Why doesn't black take? I think it's not. I believe it's not that attractive to take here because of check. So this is possible, this line, but white just ignores that finesse. Knight C3, and we go back to an open Sicilian. A6, and now this G3. So this is slightly off the beaten path, and it gives the tone of the game that white is interested in basically clamping down on D5 and B5. And to do that, sometimes A4, A5 is also trying to restrict B5. So a very positional clamping down game is basically the tone set by this move. We have E5. Slight downside is black's pawn structure is more static here, and D5 can be really locked down now. Potentially, we have Knight DE2, and these moves are quite common now in this line. Pretty standard. Bishop E6. Now A4, so trying to clamp down on B5. We have Knight Bd7. Bishop E3. The knight attacks the bishop. The bishop just drops back. And here, okay, instead of repeating, that would be nice for David Eggleston to get a draw. No, A5 is played. So the clamps are set on B6 now. And after Queen C7, B3, Rook Fc8, and here is a really curious and fascinating part of the game. It's a very, very interesting move here, and it kind of shows something about this position which is really interesting, to me at least, philosophically, that essentially black potentially has 2 backward pawns on A6 and D6. If black ever plays B5, he's going to have 2 backward pawns. And what can you do when your opponent has backward pawns? Pressure them. And what is the vehicle for pressurizing backward pawns? Well, actually, in this game, we start to see one of the major vehicles as a battery. So battery is when you sort of have the same sort of thing, combining forces to magnify the battery strength. And here we have this move Rook A2, and if the queen gets behind the rook, then we've got a battery on this A file to try and really restrict black from ever playing B5. But black actually dares to liberate his position rebelliously by playing B5 here, giving black another backward pawn to potentially torture with batteries. But if black didn't play B5, let's say black played Bishop D8, white can actually maybe start weaving his web, Adams weaving his web around B6 with Knight A4. And he's got the other one to torture anyway, Bishop B4. So actually by clamping this one, he's torturing this one from this angle. This is a fascinating thing. And here we can even have a Roxy bind to really fix D6. So it seems, D6 would be subject to torture in this line if black didn't play for B5. I mean, this looks like a completely ideal position. I would say Adams is very Karpovian, because actually Karpov also played sometimes Roxy bind structures just to snuff out the opponent's counterplay, and black is really passive here. So black bid for freedom here, liberation, by playing b5. But the problem is, after this b5, yeah, there's another backward pawn, and here is where the torture process with batteries. We see a beautiful move. Can you guess what white plays here? Well, it was facilitated by rook a2. Okay, queen a1. So just immediately threatening the pawn. This battery here, this energy built up. But what's really remarkable now, from a positional perspective, okay, there's two backward pawns, but white builds the flexibility to very quickly torture both, almost like simultaneously, because we see queen b7 protecting the a6 pawn, rook d1. Now the sights are set on d6 as well. So we see bishop d7, and now bishop g5. So the pressure's starting to be put in immediately. Now this is threatened because bishop takes f6, if rook takes d6. So black is trying to defend now d6 with dear life. You know, if black had played h6, just to show that fully, then we just take, and there's no real compensation here for black. So black's defending with rook c6. We have h3, h6, bishop drops back. So with h3, there's no harassment with knight g4 now. The bishop is going to drop back to e3 finally. Of course, this gives the option for taking potentially and knight d5 and stuff. Queen c8. There is black with a battery here, but white just protects that h3 pawn. Bishop d8. And now rook d2. And I think, in a way, with rook d2, white is showing that at leisure he can now put pressure now on d6 as well. With this battery, he can switch between batteries. He's got a luxury military apartment here. He can torture a6 or d6 with queen d1. And in fact, you know, if the rook was on d1, queen c1, there's also another battery, by the way, on h6. 3 candidate batteries to choose from. We have h5, and now this is really a curious move, which you might think is really strange, but rook d3. And you might think, well, the purpose of rook d3 is actually A, to discourage h4, because maybe the rook can switch across, but B, to protect c3. But you know, as it turned out, if white wants to play queen d1, say black had played king h8 instead, you know, as it turns out here, actually, tactically, white can play queen d1. It doesn't matter about losing both knights here, because this position is crashing through. This position is advantageous for white. So like this, it's too much pressure. So anyway, bit of torture maybe, rook d3. So saying to black, well, I can play now at leisure this battery. I can switch my attention to this backward pawn with queen d1. Get ready for that. But I've also got the option of queen c1 as well, which might be useful as another battery. Not really targeting anything. The pawn's like been taken away from target practice on h6. We have knight e8 though. So fundamentally, black's got a passive position. It seems as though this nice battery here, and white can switch to d6. But how does white actually ramp up the pressure? Isn't the pressure like optimal now? Well, we see queen d1, and black tries to liberate again. He's like rebellious. a4, as if he's trying to get rid of his weakness maybe. But now d6 is really tortured. The pressure is ramped up. Knight b5. And note that c2 is adequately protected, so black has to react. Queen b8 protecting d6. So how to ramp up the pressure now? Actually, there's a loose piece behind this d6 pawn. Behind this backward pawn is a loose piece. So white tries to tap into these weaknesses. He plays actually f4. It might seem a bit risky, potentially because this queen is eyeing the king on that diagonal. But the immediate threat is f takes e. So black tries to reinforce things very quickly with bishop f6. What else? I mean, he doesn't really want to take, because then we're kind of liberating potentially this bishop with e5 later. So black tries to hold things together. But now we do have an isolation of that pawn. It's not just a backward pawn, it's like isolated. Although black seems to be pointing a bit at g3, but and d6 is held up for the moment. But actually this knight transfers now, knight bd4, hitting the rook with tempo. It goes over here. Immediate threat now, knight takes e5 and rook takes d7. Bishop gets out of the way. Has black sorted out his problems? Not quite, knight f4. And black decides to take this knight off actually. Yeah, I mean, the knight is also attacking the pawn. So what can black do here? Doesn't really want to play g6. On knight d7, in fact, maybe best to actually ignore this and just take on e6. This position is just very, very nice for white. White is better there. So anyway, black took off that knight. G takes. Now we have a4. If black tries to make a space for his bishop against f5, knight d4, this position is dangerous. This kind of position is very dangerous. And d6 could drop off quite easily. So, okay, so we see a4, trying to dissolve at least this weakness, get rid of this backward pawn there. We have now knight g5. So looking at things like queen takes h5 now, and knight e6, queen h5 and queen h7, all sorts of possibilities. Black plays a takes b. Rook takes a8. Now, remember actually, well, I've noticed very recently, I was researching forcing moves actually, and some articles are duplicating something which I think is not correct, that capture is not actually a forcing move. It has the appearance and some of the properties of a forcing move in that most of the time you're forced to recapture, right? But the only real forcing moves are actually checks, because the opponent's legally bound to handle a check. So when you calculate variations, you've got to check for the, the Zwischenzugs. So here, I mean, black played knight takes a8. You can't take with the queen. The b6 knight's going to drop off. For example, it seems as though that's fairly clear cut anyway. But actually, it turned out here. This is why I added variations this morning. Black could try Zwischenzug. In fact, it's one of the engine ideas. If you check this game, black doesn't have to recapture the rook. It's not entirely a forcing move. Black could consider b takes c2. Now, I don't know. Unfortunately, we can never quite know unless the players are interviewed or annotate the games what exactly they saw from this position. But there's some complicated details here. It seems there's two main choices if this Zwischenzug had happened. This is just from a scientific angle now. This is analysis. It seems, from my analysis, that rook takes b8 is the best shot for an advantage. And I'll show you why. Take the queen off. Rook takes c8, threatening rook takes e8 checkmate, because the knight's covering h7. The queen's attacked, so the queen comes to the rescue of the knight. Rook takes e8, because actually the rook is attacked here. And now the point is to take this b6, and white's collected quite a lot of pieces for the queen. And this should be advantageous in theory for white, this position. So this would be a way of getting an advantage. But I don't know if this variation was actually seen by either of the players. It could be purely, I mean, in a theoretical sense, we're analysing this Zwischenzug here. You might think, isn't queen takes h5 just crushing? It turns out here, this position with e5 looks immediately like as though it's going to be crushing, because we're hitting the queen, and if d5, we have f5, and this is really crushing this position. White's actually winning here because look at f7. Yeah, it's going to be a total disaster for black's king side. But actually, there's resources in this position based on black's c2 pawn. The magic of Zwischenzugs is like you're not caring about the opponent. You want to care about your assets and pursuing your assets and having maximum time to pursue your trump cards. I know we shouldn't really say trump cards at the moment, Donald Trump, but anyway, the trump card for black is here, and actually there's a resource here. This is an incredible variation. This is what I was saying this morning. Oh no, what is this? Should I mention this? But actually there is an incredible idea with knight c4, and it turns out black is close to equalizing here. E.g. taking, knight takes e3, check. This is crazy stuff. E takes d, threatening queen h8 mate. Rook takes d6, check. Rook takes e6, check. Now ignoring this with king d7, because otherwise there's queen takes g7, that's horrible. Queen takes c8, check. Bishop c6, check. This position, only a tiny advantage for white. So we can draw the conclusion, if that's seriously the case, that it may be, in theory, black was better off with the Zwischenzug b takes c2. But I have no idea, actually, if either player would have seen these crazy variations. So that's sometimes the fun of analysing games. You get the practical perspective, you try and get empathy of the players, but you get sometimes a theoretical insight into these positions. As someone with a correspondence server, this is the closest I get to correspondence game research, really, to actually research positions in depth. Okay, so we have c takes b3. All of that stuff ignored, basically after knight takes a8. So white's still protecting the pawn. He's still got queen h5, and in fact, it's really bad now after g6. White just plays f5. It's crushing. It's a crushing position here. d5 check. G takes f5. Black's pawns have been dismantled and completely fractured. Look at this fracturing. Diced. Isolated. Doubled and isolated. It's horrible. It's really bad. And the queen's coming to h5, the ideal spot for delivering some checkmates pretty soon. Knight d6, defending f7 with dear life, but bishop f4 pinning the knight with the option of taking. Queen h7 check, and the game ended here. It's actually a forced mate here. Black resigned. If king f8, can you see the forced mate? I hope so. You just take the knight actually, which is defending f7. So if queen takes, we just play queen takes f7. Otherwise, it's over anyway. We just mate with either queen g8 or queen h8. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So the game ended here. I found it a fascinating game, I must admit. Another kind of Karpov type victory. There was potential for even a Maroczy bind. Black did try to liberate his position. He tried to dissolve his backward a pawn. But white's torture methods, the batteries, the potential batteries, they created weaknesses. Nde2 once said the threat is stronger than the execution. I think with batteries you create potential threats all the time. And black ended up softening himself up with h5. Maybe he was concerned about something on the king side. And that h5 was like a sitting target later after f5 was played. It was exposed as a sitting target. So one question is, could black have left his h-pawn where it was earlier on. But again, it's a battery on h6 potentially. Maybe there was sacks there. There's a lot of avenues for investigation of this game. But it seems black, when black plays h5, he's kind of weakening his king fundamentally. And obviously white crashed through in this game. There's a lot of avenues, as I say, for investigation. But I thought it was a very, very interesting game. And, they say, well, I get the impression, if you want to try and find the most instructive games, actually they're not often like the Tau games, because the Tau games are often very rich tactically. It's often the positional players. Irving Chernev, in his book Most Instructive Games of Chess, I noticed actually it was games of Petrosian he chose quite a lot more than, say, Tau. There's only one game of Tau. It's the positional players like Adams which often provide really great instructive games, based on pawn structure, the slowest elements of the position, where you can really understand strategically about things, about pressure, long-term pressure, breakthroughs, how to torture pawns, etc. You can learn a lot from the positional players. So a magnificent game from Adams. Comments, questions, likes appreciated. Thanks very much.